So today we're looking at Unit 4, Area of Study 2, and this is the people and the courts. So it links in nicely from the end of Area of Study 1, but looks more specifically at how the Parliament, the people and the courts work in unison together. Firstly, for KK1, you will need to know the factors that impact on Parliament's ability to make law. This is covered on page 254 to 261 of your text in more detail. Now, if you are Parliament, what are some of the hurdles that you must overcome, or some of the issues that impact your ability to pass law in this country? Firstly, what can be perceived as a good thing can also be a challenge, and it's the role of the Houses of Parliament. We have a bicameral system, and the composition of each House of Parliament has a significant impact on lawmaking ability. Whether we have a majority or minority government, whether rubber stamping is occurring, or we have a hostile Senate, the composition of Parliament has an impact on their ability to pass law, whether it's easy or whether it's hard. Also, the representative nature of Parliament can create a hurdle. The democratic practices of the Commonwealth and Victorian parliaments impact lawmaking. We have regular elections, and through the media, public accountability. Now, politicians, this is their job. This is their livelihood. And because of the representative nature, the fact that they are voted in by the people, at times this can be a hurdle to their ability to make law. A law might need to be made, but it might not be particularly popular, and this will play on the minds of parliamentarians. Also, political pressures. The actions of political parties and the groups within them and outside of Australia can impact on lawmaking. There could be domestic pressures, such as the local media, local Australian groups. They could have pressure from their own parties about what laws should be promoted or voted against. And we also have international pressure from other countries to make certain laws and uphold them here in Australia. Also, the other hurdle, restrictions. Now, Parliament don't have ultimate lawmaking power. There are some constitutional limitations on the operation of Parliament, such as exclusive and concurrent powers, and also those 5 pesky express rights. You should be able to answer a practice question similar to this and swap it for any of the 4 points discussed. For example, explain what political pressures are and outline how they aid the process of parliamentary lawmaking and one way in which they inhibit it. So to get your 3 marks, you would want to be able to discuss the term political pressures and have a strength and a weakness. You could easily swap this question for a different practice question, saying, how does the role of Parliament, or how does the representative nature, or how do the restrictions on lawmaking Parliament, and then still use the rest of the question, aid the process of parliamentary lawmaking or inhibit it. KK2. The role of the Victorian and High Courts in lawmaking. We know a lot about the court hierarchy, and that this allows the doctrine of precedent to operate. We have a binding precedent. These are decisions made from higher courts that must be followed by lower courts, and persuasive precedent. So decisions made by equal or lower courts that could influence judges' decisions. Now, why is this information on the courts here in this area of study? Well, it's about how the courts and the Parliament and the people work together. Now, perhaps if there is a law or a precedent that a judge doesn't like, what are their opportunities to avoid being constrained by precedent? Firstly, there is reversing the precedent if they are of an appropriate court to do so, or overruling it. They could distinguish or disapprove of it altogether. Now, disapproving won't actually remove the precedent, but it may influence the Parliament to reconsider. This is gone through in more detail on page 267 and 272 of your text. Here is a practice question that you could look at. Discuss the ability of the courts to provide consistency as lawmakers. Now, VCAR might throw you this type of curveball. It doesn't ask you about precedent, but when it talks about consistency of lawmaking in the courts, we know the only answer is precedent. So for a 5 marker, I would talk about what precedent is, how it adds to consistency, 2 strengths of precedent and 2 limitations. And you could use those role of the judges here with the reversing, overruling, distinguishing and disapproving as part of your response. KK3, the reasons for and the effect of statutory interpretation. Flashback, what was statutory interpretation? This is where the judge must interpret the wording of the legislation and apply meaning to the case before them. Why do we have statutory interpretation? Well, if we have really broad words, we're going to need to provide a really specific set of facts. And we're going to have to apply this really broad legislation to this person's case. This is a tricky job. We also have a changing nature of words. What one word meant when the law was made may not be the meaning that it holds in current society. You could think back to the Kevin case about the word man, and also unforeseen circumstances. So the law's been made and someone's been charged with a crime and that's not what they intended at all. For example, Dane v. Tirola with the studded belt. What are the effects of statutory interpretation? Well, it creates a precedent. Because the judges had to make a ruling on a particular case, when a similar case comes forward, that is now the law. It also broadens, or in some cases narrows, the application of the law, making it more specific and easier to apply. Furthermore, it could lead to Parliament amending legislation that simply isn't working. Let's have a look at this practice question. Discuss the extent to which you believe statutory interpretation is an effective way to make the law. So I would outline statutory interpretation, I would answer to what extent, and 2 strengths of statutory interpretation and 2 weaknesses. So again, I would use my reasons and effects there to help me construct that answer. KK4. What are the factors that impact lawmaking ability of the courts? Now, this is a separate question to the one that was in KK1, which is about the lawmaking ability of Parliament. This is about the lawmaking ability of the courts. Firstly, precedent. Precedent can be a really good thing because it creates a really consistent court decision system. But it can also be a negative because judges in the lower courts must follow it, even if perhaps they do not agree with the decision that's been made by another judge. 2, the courts are impacted by judicial conservatism. This is where a judge doesn't really like to make controversial rulings on their cases. They don't see it in some ways as their job to make the law, and as such, they apply really narrow rulings. They don't want to interpret the statutes. Now, this can really limit some of our common laws. On the flip side of that, you've got judicial activism where you have judges that are really keen to change the law. On the plus side, yes, that's great because we've got judges out there interpreting all different statutes, but then also we get that level of inconsistency as well. Costs and time are huge factors with lawmaking in the courts. Perhaps there are great opportunities there for common law to evolve, but people really don't have the cost or the time to attend court to do so. And lastly, people also have the requirement of standing. You can't simply bring a case to court. You actually need to have something have happened to you to actually have a case to stand for in the courts. Again, you could use this question and repeat it multiple times. Explain the impact of time and costs of bringing, how can I rephrase it? Explain the impact of time and costs upon the court to the development of common law. What you could do is you can rephrase that instead of time and cost. Say, explain the impact of precedent on the ability of the courts to make law. Explain the impact of judicial conservatism and activism on the ability to make law in the courts. So really, you could repeat that question 5 times over. KK5 looks at the relationship between Parliament and the courts. Now, this is kind of an overlap between all of the issues that we've seen with Parliament and the courts so far in their lawmaking, but it gets pretty technical. So what's the first part of their relationship? Well, there's supremacy of Parliament. In all ways, shapes and form, Parliament is supposed to be our supreme lawmakers, and it is their #1 role to do so. Now, the courts could actually influence Parliament. We can look at judges who are disapproving certain precedents, judges who are being particularly active, and those rulings could influence our Parliament to make certain laws, which we'll come to in just a second. The courts work well with our Parliament because they interpret the statutes that Parliament makes, and hopefully that all works together nice and smoothly. And it brings us to our last 2 points. So they work together through the process of codification. So if a common law is passed in the courts and Parliament particularly like it, they may codify it, meaning they will take what the judges said and they will pass a statute, turning that into statute law. They could also do the opposite, which is abrogation, where they don't like a precedent which is being set by the courts, and they aim to abolish that common law by overriding it with a different statute. Here is a good case that you could use for codification, which is the Mabo case, where the Mabo decision prompted the Commonwealth Parliament to codify the High Court decision and create the Native Title Act. You could talk about abrogation in here as well, and you could use the Trigwell case if you wanted to do that. Then we kind of move into a completely different area of this area of study, which it starts looking at law reform. So we've talked a little bit about how the courts work together with the Parliament, hopefully to create cohesive law, but now we're looking at more like the people in the courts. Now, laws need to change, and there are a whole different range of reasons why the law needs to change. It could be our community values have shifted. We've had changes in technology. We have to protect our society from new things that are arising. There could have been significant public events, or it could just be generally improving the legal system. You should have a variety of cases that you could use here. For instance, with advances in technology, you could talk about the drones, or shifts in community values. You could talk about re-Kevin and that definition of what is man to do with marriage. So make sure that you have some relevant cases to go with reasons for law reform as well. Any cases need to be within the last 4 years to be able to be used on the exam. So I strongly suggest that you use your textbook, because the Ed Rollo textbook is edited annually. So all of the examples in there should be relevant to the current study design, and you can't go wrong with them. Another practice question, which you could change multiple times, you could just swap the reason. Discuss the extent to which Parliament should respond to changes in advancing technology. Justify your answer. So you could easily swap advancing technology to be community values or protection of society to change up that question to have another go at it in a different light. You should also know KK7, which is the means by which an individual can reform the law. You'll need to be able to define a petition, a demonstration, and the courts. So a person like you and me, we kind of have three options. Firstly, the petition, which is a written document where multiple people sign to show their support for a particular change. We then have public demonstrations as well, where people get out there and really voice their opinion in large physical demonstrations. And lastly, but we have the option to go to court. What you will need to know are some strengths and weaknesses for each of these approaches. Now, petitions are obviously more cost effective and time effective, but are they really effective? Does the government have to do anything with them? Well, no. Same with demonstrations. Demonstrations can be great because people, they see you, you're on the news, but also if you're causing a whole heap of inconvenience and, you know, maybe you don't have a lot of numbers, people will just think you're annoying and they won't listen to you. And the courts are the same. They are really costly, really time poor, but at least you'll get a proper judicial determination. Again, this question could be modified to answer any of those prompts. So evaluate the ability of petitions to affect legislative change. You could easily swap petitions in there for demonstrations or the courts to give you a different practice question each time. KK8, which is one of my favourites, looks at the role of the media in law reform. You must know both traditional and social media. So traditional being your radio, your TV, your newsprint, and your social media being more like your Facebook and your GoFundMes and all your online petition sites, etc. Why does this influence law reform? Well, the more media attention you get, you can create greater community awareness. It allows lawmakers to be informed of public opinion, so you can really get your voice out there through the media and the parliamentarians can read that and see that. It also provides many different groups with a platform to change opinions. You'll also need to be able to know some strengths and some weaknesses. Obviously, some strengths is like the power to the people. You get information out in a really quick and effective way. But the weaknesses are our media. Businesses are actually businesses that are owned by people and may push or shield their own agendas. Using examples, describe two ways the media can prompt legislative change. So again, you would talk about your traditional and your social media. Those examples must be within the last 4 years, so use your textbook examples to help you illustrate. KK9, we're looking at the role of the Victorian Law Reform Commission, also known as VLRC. We did this as an in-class practice task, so perhaps you missed this during remote learning. It's important that you go back to your textbook and read this in more detail, as this is just a summary. So the VLRC, it is their job to make law reform recommendations on matters that have been referred to them. Now, the VLRC also aim to educate the community on areas of law reform. They do consistently monitor and coordinate law reform activity and suggest areas of law reform. You will again need to know the strengths and the weaknesses of the VLRC. Now, it's great because they are an independent body. They have certain powers to ensure they get the information they need to make the reports that they have. For example, the medicinal cannabis law reform recommendations that you can see there. But it is quite limited because it must have matters referred to it. Again, make sure that you are consistently looking at examples that are 2018 onwards. For example, you might be given something like this. So using an example, discuss the extent to which the VLRC are able to influence law reform. So what are two strengths of the VLRC, two limitations, and perhaps the example there of medicinal cannabis. This is separate to our final point, which is about the role of parliamentary committees. Now, parliamentary committees and VLRC are not the same. Parliamentary committees are a group, and they can be government or non-government members who undertake work on behalf of Parliament to investigate an issue. There are committees that are long-term, which are standing committees, select committees or joint investigatory committees that look at particular issues that arise over time. Now, why do we have these committees? Well, they provide an avenue for the community to express their opinions on law reform. They allow for expert opinion on certain issues, and at the end, the committee provides recommendations to Parliament about law reform. It can also be a check on Parliament because perhaps Parliament is the issue being investigated. Now, this is great because we have, again, the community and lots of experts giving their opinion on issues. But the limitation is that these parliamentary committees are set up by Parliament. And of course, that can probably limit some of the issues that they look at. An example that we looked at in detail was end-of-life choices, which most students did really well on. This is the type of question that you could be given. So recommendations to change the law that come from parliamentary committees demonstrate an appreciation of the community's values and expectations. Using one recent example, explain why this is correct. So hopefully this shows to you the amount of examples you could be asked for on the exam. What I've done to make this easier for you is on your OneNote, I have collated a series of tables which will help you organise the key concepts into definitions, strengths, limitations, and examples. I would spend my time over the next couple of days really refining that, making sure that you are comfortable with those tables and the information in them. And if you need any support with it, let me know, or any support with the practice questions you've looked at today. Again, there is a final trial exam that you can choose to do this week. It must be handed in by Friday if you can't attend on Wednesday to do it with me in order for it to be marked. Otherwise, I suggest strongly that you spend your time filling in the OneNote tables and doing the practice questions on the last two areas of study.